I'm begging my colleagues to help me pass my Access to Family Building Act, a bill that would ensure that every American's right to become a parent via treatments like IVF is fully protected, regardless of what state they live in, helping guarantee that no hopeful parent or doctor in this country can be held criminally liable for starting or growing a family through IVF.
Reserving the right to object.
The Senator from Mississippi.
The bill before us today is a vast overreach that is full of poison pills that go way too far beyond ensuring legal access to IVF, creating rights to human cloning. The genetic engineering of human embryos and surrogacy is too extreme and goes far beyond IVF. This bill misses the mark.
Republicans have blocked this bill to protect IVF. Now remember that, for all of their talk about supporting IVF, when it came down to it, right here in this chamber, Republicans blocked IVF protection.
After a decade struggling with infertility after my service in Iraq, I was only able to get pregnant through the miracle of IVF. IVF is the reason I get to experience the chaos and the beauty, the stress and the joy that is motherhood. IVF is the reason that my husband and I aren't just Tammy and Brian, but we're mom and dad. IVF made our family. It made my heart whole. It made my life full. But for countless women in Alabama, that desperately sought after dream of becoming a mom just became so much harder. Last week, that state's Supreme Court ruled that frozen embryos created through IVF should be considered children under state law, a ruling that paints women like me and our doctors as criminals, and one that throws IVF access into chaos as countless women and doctors try to figure out whether they might be criminalized for simply trying to create a family. If you're thinking that this makes no sense, you're right. You're not misunderstanding anything. You're not missing something. It's the nightmarish blend of hypocrisy and misogyny that you think it is. The very people who claim to be defending family values are the ones trying to enact dystopian policies that would prevent Americans from starting their own families. It's a little personal when a majority male state Supreme Court suggests that people like me who became parents with the help of modern medicine should be in jail cells and not nurseries. And I know I'm not the only one who struggles to understand how elected representatives who back these kinds of policies can call themselves members of the so-called party of life. No, rulings like this one and the bills with the same intent that are being pushed forward in state legislatures around the country are not about being pro-life. They're about catering to an extremist base by exerting even more control over women's bodies, inserting politicians into some of the most intimate personal decisions anyone could ever make. The overturning of Roe is what made last week's ruling even possible, as it stripped women of a constitutional right, transferring the power to decide whether or when to start families from us to politicians in state houses across the country. Donald Trump is the one who brags about taking down Roe v. Wade. Donald Trump is the one who acts as if that's something to be proud of. So while it may now be convenient for him to claim that he had nothing to do with what happened in Alabama, we know the truth. IVF is at risk because of him. He is to blame, him and every other GOP official who shamelessly kisses his ring, proving with every word they say that they care more about protecting his poll numbers than protecting Americans' freedoms. The reality is, 1 in 4 married women have difficulty getting pregnant or carrying a pregnancy to term. That number doesn't even include partnerless Americans or other families also trying to have kids. That's 1 in 4 in red states and in blue states, in big cities and rural towns, in the wealthiest neighborhoods of the poorest and in the poorest of zip codes. Because infertility doesn't discriminate between party lines. It doesn't recognize state borders. No one should feel that someone else's religious beliefs or partisan slants could rob them of their chance to get pregnant. And no doctor should have to risk a criminal record just to provide women basic health care. So to my Republican colleagues, please think about how many that 1 in 4 equates to in your state. Women willing to go through expensive, painful medical treatments just for a chance to experience the smallest, most banal moments of parenthood. just to have a newborn to swaddle, a baby whose diaper needs to be changed, a toddler who needs their shoes to be tied. And if you believe that they have the right to be called mom without also being called a criminal, then all you have to do to prove it is to let us pass this should be obvious legislation.
Madam President, I support the ability for mothers and fathers to have total access to IVF in bringing new life into the world. I also believe human life should be protected. These are not mutually exclusive. Let's be clear about what the Alabama case is about. This was a case brought by families whose human embryos were killed when an unauthorized individual walked into the fertility clinic through an unsecured door, removed several human embryos, and dropped them, causing their deaths. The court's holding in favor of the parents found that these frozen human embryos are children under Alabama law. It did not ban IVF, nor has any state banned IVF. The bill before us today is a vast overreach that is full of poison pills that go way too far beyond ensuring legal access to IVF. The Act explicitly waives the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and would subject religious and pro-life organizations to crippling lawsuits. Religious and pro-life organizations could be forced to facilitate procedures that violate their core beliefs, including their health insurance plans. This would be the first time the bipartisan Religious Freedom Restoration Act, introduced by then Representative Chuck Schumer, was explicitly waived. The bill's expansion definition of artificial reproductive technology sweeps in much more than IVF and has far-reaching implications. It would legalize human cloning. It would legalize commercial surrogacy, including for young girls without parental involvement. It would legalize gene-edited designer babies and lift the federal ban on the creation of 3-parent embryos. It would legalize the creation of human-animal chimeras. Other developed countries like Germany, New Zealand, and Australia, as well as states like Louisiana, have policies that allow for IVF coupled with common sense protections to respect human life. Creating rights to human cloning, the genetic engineering of human embryos, and surrogacy is too extreme and goes far beyond IVF. This bill misses the mark. We should strive to do both, and this bill does not do that. Therefore, I object.
I have the greatest respect and admiration for my friend from Mississippi, but I have to say that I disagree with her interpretation of my piece of legislation. This bill does 3 things and 3 things only. It protects the right of individuals to seek assistive reproductive technology without fear of being prosecuted for seeking that technology. It preserves the right of physicians to provide that assistive reproductive technology without fear of being prosecuted. And it also allows insurance companies to cover assistive reproductive technology. That is all that it does. It does not force anyone to seek reproductive technology. It does not force anyone to offer it. It does not force anyone to cover it. It simply says you have a statutory right, should you choose to pursue assistive reproductive technology, that you will be able to do so. I also want to note that in Louisiana, there is already state law that prohibits the discardation of frozen embryos or of frozen fertilized eggs. This has already started. In Florida, there is a bill pending before the state legislature that would deem that a fertilized egg is a human being and provide for the opportunity for penalties to be put into judgment for those who would discard those fertilized eggs. So this is a real threat today.
You know, women across the country use IVF to start and grow their families. You're hearing that not only from Senator Duckworth, I've heard it from so many people in Nevada and really across the country. They make that choice in consultation with their partners, their families, and their doctors, not a government official, not a government official. There is no logical reason to deny women that right. And yet, after Roe versus Wade fell, we could see from a mile away that IVF was in danger. Senator Duckworth was one of the first to come forward and recognizing that, and that's why her legislation is so important. Why? Because attacking IVF was yet another chance for anti-choice Republicans to erode women's rights in this country. They've introduced a federal abortion ban that would supersede state laws. They've stacked the courts with anti-choice judges. They've limited funding to women's health care. And they have repeatedly ignored the very science behind reproductive health care in order to push their agenda. We knew this was coming. In fact, we tried to do something about it a year ago. After Roe was overturned, not only did Senator Duckworth come to the floor with her legislation, we have introduced numerous legislation on this floor to protect women's rights. And every single time, unfortunately, one of our Republican colleagues comes forward to object without any explanation, but continuing to really erode women's rights in this country. And I have to say, these extreme GOP colleagues of ours claim to be pro-life. They claim to champion family planning, but really when it comes down to it, they don't support it. You just have to be in our communities and listen to the women and their families, and you understand that. The difference this time around is that the Alabama Supreme Court is actually calling their bluff. The threat to IVF is no longer this hypothetical. I don't care what party you are. I don't care if you're Democrat, you're Republican, you're nonpartisan. A majority of Americans want women to have this right to choose. They want them to have this ability. They believe in having families. They believe in IVF. They believe in women's reproductive rights. And most importantly, what some of our Republican colleagues are doing is inhibiting and limiting women's access to 21st century health care. That's what this is about. Why should we deny women the right to access 21st century health care? If it's going to save their lives, it's going to help them have families, what is wrong with that at the end of the day? So I have to thank Senator Duckworth, and it's unfortunate that we had an objection to her legislation that is so needed, unfortunately, in this day and age, but it is. That's where we are today, fighting for women's rights, fighting across this country. And finally, my only other question to my colleagues is, I trust women to make this decision. Why don't they?
You know, I've been really awed and humbled by the eloquence of the women senators who have preceded me, and I hesitate to add to what they've stated so powerfully already, but of course, I'm a man, and this bill is about women's reproductive care and women's rights, but it is also about the rights of all of us. The name of the act is the Access to Family Building Act. It's about families. It's about men like myself whose most awesome moment in life was the time they held their newly born child. Men have an equal stake in the issue that brings us here today. Men should be as scared and angry as women are about this trend, which is so destructive to basic rights and liberties. Women's rights are human rights. The rights at stake here are rights that are American. What could be more American than wanting to bring a child into the world? And what could be more heartbreaking? We've all been through it, through friends, neighbors, maybe our own family. Man and woman in love, wanted to have a child, miscarriages, other obstacles that prevent it. And there is a hole in their hearts, a hole in their homes and their families as they struggle with issues of fertility and childbirth. This measure very simply guarantees the right for women and families everywhere, in Alabama and Connecticut, in every state in this country, to access the fertility care they need to bring children into the world. What has become devastatingly and tragically clear is that the Republican Party's animosity towards women's health and women's rights doesn't stop at abortion. It's why I asked that IVF question in 2020, and it's why I didn't get a clear answer from a Republican nominee to the Supreme Court. The war on women and on reproductive choices by women and the war on families hasn't stopped at abortion or even IVF.
Senator, your time is up.
So I conclude by thanking my colleagues who have brought this measure to the floor, particularly Senator Duckworth, and I regret that Republicans have blocked this measure. Thank you, Madam President.
Republican opposition to IVF is terrifying. It makes me furious, but it should not surprise anyone. Donald Trump set the stage for the attacks on reproductive rights when he stacked the Supreme Court with ultra-conservative justices and overturned Roe versus Wade. And since then, Republicans banned or severely restricted abortion in 24 states. They're trying to ban medication abortion nationwide. And now in Alabama, these extremists have virtually outlawed IVF, fertility care that gives people a chance to start a family. This has always been about conservative politicians controlling women's bodies. This has been Donald Trump and the Republicans' plan all along. And the opposition to Senator Duckworth's proposal today shows that Republicans are doubling down against reproductive freedom. They are coming for medication abortion. They are coming for birth control. And they are even coming for prenatal care. Make no mistake, we will fight them every step of the way. I want to talk for just a minute about the people who are affected by these extremist policies. Families in Alabama who have been wanting and praying that IVF can help them have a baby. Women who have injected themselves with medication for weeks or months or even years. People who have spent an entire life savings trying to start a family, only now to see their hopes go down the drain. LGBTQ families who have spent years taking on every obstacle just for the chance to have a baby of their own. And for some, this was the last chance. And now, Republicans like Donald Trump and those in this chamber might try to backtrack, might try to say that they are working to protect IVF. But it's all talk. Senate Republicans' actions today speak louder than any empty promises they make. Americans can tell when Republican politicians try to talk out of both sides of their mouths. The American people want reproductive freedom. The American people support parents and those desperately trying to become parents. So here's what comes next. Democrats have made clear that we stand with President Biden, with Vice President Harris, and with the millions of families affected by these heartless policies. We stand to protect reproductive rights for people all across this country. And together, we will fight for every person to have access to a safe abortion. We will fight for every family to have access to the services needed to have a baby. And we won't stop fighting until we secure the Congress that we need to protect reproductive freedom for everyone in this country. I am proud to be a co-sponsor of Senator Duckworth's bill, and together we're going to get this done. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.